Good day, my friends. Let's talk about economic systems and schools of thought. A more equitable society is a happier society. Would you agree or disagree? And rate the incentives, the sacrifices, and the alternatives involved here. If you don't know what equitable means, look it up. Economic systems are based on two important questions. One is that of ownership. The other one is that of distribution. So who is the owner of the resources and how are the outputs allocated among the people? All right. So here we have basically two main schools of thought. One of them is socialism. One of them is the market economy. Okay. So public property and private property refer to the element of ownership, and state allocation versus market allocation refer to the element of distribution. All right, so that's how things are mapped out here. You can think of other mixes in between socialism and market economy, but by studying these two, the other ones will also be clear. Other names for market economy is free enterprise economy and capitalism. Other names for socialism is centralized planning, planned economy, quota system, and command economy. So these are all synonymous. I don't use the word capitalism because it carries some negative connotation. You could also think of communism. It also carries some negative connotation. I prefer not to use these words. Here's the thing, guys. You have to be careful not to get caught up with the connotations of the words. Okay, that's a fallacy, to use a word with a connotation and then prove that that is wrong. Okay, so try to use neutral words. Now, this centralized and public, whenever you see the word public and centralized in economics, what it means is governmental. So we're talking about governmental property and governmental planning. And quota means a fixed share, right? So you get a fixed share for every day. So pause here, record the slide number, write a one-sentence summary of this slide in your own words, and some notes. This is a super important slide. It shows you how to think, how to analyze, and how to argue professionally. All right. So we looked at two main systems, socialism and capitalism, or free market economy. And we want to see what is the strength and weakness of each, and what are the arguments in favor of each. So we're going to look at the arguments given by the proponents of each school. Whether the arguments are true or not, we're going to look at it later. But first of all, we have to clarify our objectives and our values. Okay, so I'm going to show you a systematic way of thinking. What is an argument for private property? Two arguments would be resources are used most efficiently and it respects individual liberty. What is an argument for public property? Two arguments are the resources are not unjustly abused and it promotes fraternity and social cohesion. Okay, that relates to the element of ownership. The other thing we talked about was distribution. What is an argument for market allocation? It promotes voluntary cooperation and no waste. The argument for state allocation would be greater equality and greatest social well-being. All right, now notice that all of these things are things that we care about. All of these things are good things. Okay, so later on we have to sift through. But first, we can kind of wrap some of them and tidy up. We can bundle them into smaller chunks that are more manageable. If you remember French Revolution, what was the main motto of the French Revolution? We had three things, right? One of them was liberty, so we have that here. One of them was fraternity, we have that here. And one of them was equality, égalité, right? So we have all of those here. And as economists, we also have one more value which is super important and we have to care about it, and that is efficiency. All right, so economists care about efficiency as well. Now, one thing also to clarify here is that if you look at fraternity, it overlaps with efficiency and equality, right? So to get rid of that overlap, what we do is we are gonna replace it with equity so that we have three clear objectives. These are three values, and notice that they're really valuable. We care about all of these things and these are all important, okay? But guess what? We are living in an imperfect world. It's not a utopia. So what it means is that we cannot achieve all of these things to the maximum degree. What it means is that we have to do our best. We have to optimize, and that's what an economist does, by the way, okay? So we're gonna look at it. There's gonna be some opportunity cost. It's unavoidable, right? But we have to make the most of it to the best of our ability. So pause here, record the slide number. I would say write a one-sentence summary of what you learned from this slide. If you want to watch it again, do it. It's really about this systematic way of breaking down arguments into the objectives involved, and then later on we're going to look at these objectives. Now that we know our values, it's important to clarify our definitions. Efficiency means maximizing society's well-being, getting the most of our resources with the least cost and the greatest benefit. We had a lot of notes on efficiency so far in the course, so you might need to refer to your notes from the beginning of the course when we talked about the market, so you have to know that. Liberty is when individuals can pursue their well-being without coercion, when there is no paternalism, which means when the decisions are made by an authority, right? So paternalism is this idea that people are treated as children, where the parent has to take care of them, right? Like a big brother. Equity is distributing economic well-being fairly among the people, and usually that involves taking from the haves and giving it to the have-nots. We are equal in humanity, but we differ by luck. This is quite important, so I want to explain it to you. Think of yourself. Think of all of the things that you have. Do you deserve that, or were you born into it? Think of all of the privileges that you've had in your childhood and other children didn't have. There is a huge element of luck in all of that. You could have been born in a different family. They could have been born in a different family. And it goes all the way until our death. It's not just for children. So people have, let's say, artistic skills and others don't. They have mathematical skills or athletic skills. And these are all distributed among the people by luck. We haven't done anything to deserve it. Yet we are equal in humanity. We are all equally human. So the argument of equity is, hang on, why should some people suffer whereas other people indulge in luxury, right? So you can see it's a very compelling and strong argument. And we're going to look at equity more because it deserves more attention. But there are also some pitfalls in it that you have to be careful about. So that's going to come up next. But before that, let's look at a very useful analogy. Think of baking a pie. And pie here is economic well-being. We would like our pie, our economic well-being, to be as big as possible, right? That is the question of efficiency. So efficiency is about maximizing the size of the pie. But also we would like to share the pie in a way that makes sense, right? So equity is about how to slice the pie, right? The size of the pie is a matter of efficiency. The slicing of the pie is a matter of equity. All right, so pause here, record the slide number, write a one-sentence summary. I would say write a little bit on each of these three objectives in your own words, and do a little picture of a pie for yourself. There are different types and levels of equity. At one level, we're talking about equal treatment of everyone. So that would be like health and education, which is available to anyone regardless. Another type is minimum standard, which is also called social insurance, and that would be a safety net. So equal treatment is probably too ambitious. It's not possible to have everyone having exactly equal treatment, but having a minimum standard is a little bit more modest. A third type is social justice, which is called the equality of opportunity, not equality of outcome. So the outcomes could be different, but everybody should have the opportunity to grow out of the poverty trap, okay? These are three different forms of equity, so pause here and take down some notes. There are some major problems with equity which I want you to understand. If you remember the pie, economists really focus on the size of the pie, the efficiency, but not so much about the distribution of the pie. It's not that they don't care about equity, they do care about it. They have the same values, right? But the thing is, there are practical problems with it, all right? And those practical problems have a huge opportunity cost. So as economists, we have to think, is it really worth it? Is it really worth getting involved in the discussion? So let's look at these problems. One of them is that equity is very subjective. It's not quantifiable. There is no consensus about it, and we don't know who to decide, right? So everybody knows and agrees that fairness is a good thing, but how do you define that and how do you implement it? Okay, it's not quantifiable. Another problem is that it's easily influenced and manipulated by those who have high stakes involved. Exactly because it's so vague, those who have high stakes can hijack the project basically. And that's called lobbying. So that's when the corporations or organizations put effort to influence the government, right? And those efforts, a lot of time, it takes a form of bribery. It's called legal bribery, right? Effectively, it's the same thing. and that's called rent seeking. So that's using resources to secure an advantageous position like a monopoly through legislative favoritism instead of raising one's efficiency and quality. So instead of trying to better ourselves, what we do is we try to get a share of that tax money which has been collected from the rich. Historically, equity-oriented policies have always defeated their purpose. This is super important. You just have to refer to any policy which was intended to help the poor, and you can see that it didn't achieve the purpose. It just widened the gap, and it only, at most, it favored only a select group of the poor who are on the higher levels, but those who really need it, they never received it because of the incentives. So what happens is that these government policies create artificial inequality as opposed to natural inequality. So those are the two options on the table. We cannot get rid of inequality. There's going to be either artificial or natural, and natural inequality involves liberty of the people, one. Also, natural inequality is less than artificial inequality, right? So sometimes it's like, okay, if you want to engage in all this policy making, maybe you're going to end up with something even worse. So you have to really think about the opportunity cost and the sacrifices involved. Recognizing natural inequality means recognizing liberty and the incentive to strive and prosper. All right, pause here, write the slide number and some notes for yourself in your own words. Furthermore, the government support programs for the poor tend to be paternalistic, which limit freedom. They stigmatize the poor, and they isolate them in inner cities, which are not nice places to live, and it makes it harder to find a job, right? So that's why they defeat the purpose. That's where the poverty becomes generational and becomes a trap. All right, so part of it is because of the way these policies are conducted. But with those who are not receiving these benefits, what happens is that there is a lot more transition. All right, so here's the thing. If you look at the data, it's true that about 20% of the population have 80% of the resources. And you might be like, oh no, that's not fair. But the thing is, it's not the same people. It's not the same people who are always rich, and it's not the same people who are poor. Actually, less than 10% of people stay in the same range that they are. Most of the people, over a few years, they shift between these different income levels, right? So just looking at that percentage can be very misleading. Otherwise, there is a lot of change. Also, it's a matter of incentives. We have to be very sensitive about how equity affects the incentives of the people. So here's the thing. This is a super important observation. The moment we decide to slice the pie equitably, its size will shrink, and the pie is referring to wealth or consumption or well-being, right? So here's how I wanna illustrate here. Imagine a pie, and you have a number of people. If you want to slice the pie equally, the size of the pie will immediately shrink. Now you might be like, hang on, that doesn't make sense. Well, actually it does. Here's how it works. Someone tells you you can work either 10 hours a day or 5 hours a day, and either way you get the same pay. Which one would you choose? Why on earth should you work 10 hours a day when you get the same pay and you could have worked 5 hours a day? So you can see equity kills incentives. Equity doesn't care about the incentives of the people. The thing is, the pie is created by the work of everyone. We have to incentivize the people to work hard, to innovate, to think. And the only way to incentivize them to say that, hey, if you are successful, you're going to get a bigger share, right? So that's an important element, that you cannot have a big pie and equal distribution. You have to choose one or the other. Either you get a small pie, which means everybody's poor, small pie and it's equal, or you get a big pie, but it's not perfectly equal, which means at least everybody has the chance to prosper. Another thing that we talked about was equality of opportunity, that everybody should have the chance to prosper. And we already have that. As I said, there's a lot of transition among the income groups, right? But also there's another element which is super important. When you talk about equality opportunity, think of it like this. If you want to be very concrete, what it means is that the birth of the person shouldn't affect their opportunity, right? Now, what does that mean? That kind of sounds like a good thing, but it's terrible. If your birth doesn't affect anything, what it means is that all of the babies are collected at birth. They are put somewhere else away from their parents, so that they get equal treatment and they have equal opportunity. Do you think that's going to be a good kind of a world, right? And the problem with that is, again, incentives. Think of it like this. People live forever. Now you might be like, hang on, that's not true. Well, actually it is true in the sense that they live forever through their children, right? So here's the thing. If someone works, makes an income, saves up to buy a home, when they die, do they have the right to hand down their home to their children, to hand down their wealth to their children? Of course, I mean, they worked for it. Why not? If someone works and makes an income and makes wealth, do they have the right to have their children go to a better school, to receive better education and better healthcare? I think all of us agree that if the person has worked for the money, they have the right, they're entitled to have their children receive benefits, right? Just like all of you have received benefits because of your parents. It's only fair. If you don't let the people hand down the wealth to their children, then you're killing their incentives. Okay, so this is where you have to be super sensitive. It's not that fairness is a bad thing. It's just that you have to be sensitive about the incentives involved. All right, so imposing equity will result in a lower GDP. Okay, a lower standard of living. So pause here, slide number, sentence summary, and your notes. Now, are we out of luck? No, because equity is a social value. People care about it, which means there is a demand for it. And if there's a demand for it, it means there's going to be a market solution for it, right? So the market solution is a voluntary participation in private charities, okay, aimed at helping the poor. The benefit of that is that there's more dignity around it, and there's more accountability. So charities are a lot more accountable. Remember, government is not accountable to anyone, even if they make a mistake. Who is the government competitor? There's more efficiency, and there is no bureaucratic leakage. There is no coercion, no paternalism. So it's not like the government forcing, people to pay taxes and going through all the paperwork. If it's private, and if the people who are contributing are not happy, they can switch to another one. With the government, the problem is that there is no competitor, so there is no incentive to be efficient. If the majority of people, on the other hand, don't want to help the poor, then why should the government shove it down their throat? So if you're living in a democracy, then if the people want it, they're going to make it work. And if they don't want it, they don't make it work. And one of the problems is that because of the high government taxes, the incentive for charitable activities has decreased. So people think like, hey, I'm already paying taxes for the poor, so I don't feel much incentive or responsibility to look after my neighbor. And it turns out that in the 19th century, when the taxes were very, very low, the charities were a lot. There were a lot of charities. And also, if you go to the developing countries, even though the people there are really, really poor, there are a lot of charities there. And part of the reason is that people care about it. So people do help out when there is the incentive for it. So pause here and take notes. Wow, that was cool. All right, public choice theory is a very interesting branch of economics. It's about how the government policies and taxes are determined. Okay, so basically we want to see why is it that equity policies don't work. All right, the logic, incentives, and problems applicable to the market are also applicable to the government. This is super useful. When we talk about the market, think about the logic that governs the market. Think about the incentives involved in the market, and think about the problems involved there. All of them are equally applicable to the government because it's the same people. We're talking about the same nature, and that is self-interest. So it is the self-interest in the buyers and sellers, which is about maximizing benefit and minimizing cost. The same thing happens in policymakers. They want to be elected and maintain their position. It's the same process happening. So how to win the most votes? It's through concentrated benefit and diffused cost, right? So the costs are divided over a large population, and the large population wouldn't have any incentive because each of them has a very little cost. So the cost of acting up and learning is going to be a lot more than the benefit that they get, right? But the benefit goes to small groups and they have the incentive to support. So that's where the whole lobbying thing comes into play. This is a very neat way of explaining why we get all this inefficiency in government policy, why we get rent seeking. It's because of the dynamics of winning the votes. Okay, what I want to emphasize here is this idea of concentrated benefit and diffused cost. This is really the backbone of how government policy is governed. Okay, pause here and take notes. An example of public choice theory is the supply management. So that could be limiting dairy imports to Canada, which we have. And we want to see how this affects the farmers on the one hand and the Canadian consumers on the other hand. Now, if you limit imports from other countries, what it means is that the farmers have the whole market to themselves. They have no competitors. So the prices that they can sell at will be higher because they have less competition and they're going to be happy. The consumers are going to be unhappy because they have to pay more for their living expenses. The farmers are few in numbers, so this is about concentrated benefit, and each of them would gain a lot, whereas the consumers are a lot, so each of them bears a little cost. So for them, it's kind of negligible. For the farmers, it's easy to organize and they have incentive to lobby to get together, whereas for the consumers, it's very hard to coordinate. They're dispersed all over the place. So they are like, okay, let it go, whatever. Right? So this field was developed by two major economists of the past century. So pause here and take down some notes if you want to draw a picture of a cow. We also talked about this concept of paternalism, and I want you to know what it is. It is when people are viewed to be incompetent of discerning and pursuing their real interest, and therefore the government must look after them. There's need for a bigger brother. Now, there are certain problems with that. First of all, at what expense are we getting that? Well, the main expense is liberty. We are losing our liberty, which is super valuable. Also, the government bureaucrats are also people. So why should one group be different than other? The government has no competitors, and because it doesn't have any competitors, there is no incentive to be efficient. Remember, when you have competitors, and if you don't do good, your competitors are going to win the customers. The government, there is no incentive like that. The decisions are made by those who don't meet the consequences of those decisions. All right. So again, here we have the incentive to avoid mistake would be much lower than if people were to make their own decisions. Right. So that's an argument for liberty. Pause here, write a one-sentence summary and some notes. Did you see that? It shattered. All right. Now you might be like, hang on. If paternalism is so bad, why is it that we have it? Why do we have so much government intervention? And it's important to know why we have it. The reason is we don't mind because it means less responsibility for us. So the thing is that we have actually handed over our liberty because we're lazy. That's pretty much what it is, because we don't want to take responsibility for it. And that's a problem. That's called The Road to Serfdom, which is a wonderful book by von Hayek, an amazing Austrian economist. This is an amazing book to read for your break, for your holiday. So put that in your list. Now, here's one thing. If you think about equity, where people are equal, there is a good example for it. And the example is prison. In prison, there is a very high level of equity. Everyone has the same condition. There is no private property. And everything is provided by the central authority. So actually, in prison isn't such a bad place if you think about it. They get food, they get shelter, they get medical, they get everything. But what is missing? The expense is liberty, right? So you have to be very careful about the socialist rhetoric. I want you guys to be very sensitive about it. It's very appealing. And the intentions are also nice. I don't accuse the intentions of it. But it's fundamentally flawed and leads to sacrificing our most precious asset, which is freedom. Pause here, take notes. The opposite of paternalism is rationality. Now remember, paternalism is the idea that people are like kids and they need someone to look after them. Rationality is basically this idea that people are not stupid. I put it like that because it's important. Sometimes when you read the news or you listen to politicians, they speak as if people are stupid. Okay, they're not. What does it mean? They don't make persistent errors. If somebody keeps making the same error over and over again, then they're not rational. Okay, they learn quickly from their mistakes. Again, think about the incentives. Errors are costly to those who make them. Therefore, there is incentive to avoid them. So people try to avoid them as much as possible, right? Now, we are not saying that they're Einsteins. They're not Einsteins. All we're saying is that it's possible to predict people's behavior. And this is going to be important. Rationality basically means predictability. It's not something, an outrageous claim that you're making. It's not an overestimation or over-exaggeration. All it means is that it's possible to predict the people's behavior. That's why we have a science. That's why we have social sciences. If it's not possible to predict people's behavior, why should we even study it? The fact that we're studying it, it means that there's a pattern to it. So all rationality means is that there's a pattern to people's behavior. Now you might be like, hang on, there are some people who are really stupid. Even if you say predictability, there are some people who are really random and unpredictable. Hands down, that's true. But there are two important conditions here which should be respected. One of them is we are talking about society at large, so a large number of people, and in the long run. Okay, so I would like to summarize that in a very beautiful quote which is ascribed to Abraham Lincoln. Whether he said it or not, I don't know. You can fool some of the people all of the time, and all of the people some of the time, but you cannot fool all of the people all of the time. That's what rationality is all about. Okay, and this is really important. If we accept this, which is a really humble assumption, and there's a lot of evidence for it, then there is no reason for paternalism. So pause here, record this slide number, and take some notes in your own words. Let me share with you some cool quotes by Milton Friedman. One of the great mistakes is to judge policies and programs by their intentions rather than the results, right? So the intentions are fine, no problem, but what matters is you look at the results. Is it really true that political self-interest is nobler somehow than economic self-interest? So political self-interest is what you get in socialism. Economic self-interest is what you get in a market economy. Effectively, they're the same thing. A society that puts equality before freedom will get neither. A society that puts freedom before equality will get a high degree of both. This has to do with the incentives involved and the data that we have. So what I would say here for this slide is write one sentence for your own relating to these topics that we covered. It doesn't have to be in the same line. It could be the opposite. You could be favoring equity over freedom. That's fine. It's your call. I'm sharing this with you. You might say like, hang on, why are you showing us so much Milton Friedman? You're kind of sick of it or whatever. The reason is that this is the best stuff that I found. So I find a lot of content, a lot of substance in here, and that's what I'm sharing with you as your teacher. If I knew a better source, I would have referred to that. Okay, so that's what I have got, but now it's your turn to start thinking and taking your own position. Economic systems are defined based on ownership and distribution, where ownership can be either private or public, and distribution can be either market or state. That gives us our two major schools of economics, and we have three main objectives. I would also add incentives as a main concern for any economist. So these two systems would try to achieve these objectives and should be assessed accordingly. Socialism is based on this concept of paternalism, and market economy is based on rationality. So what I want you to do is draw your own concept map using the concepts that you learned in today's lesson. If you want to copy what I have here, that's fine, but make three major changes. So three major changes, it could be either adding something or moving things around or some other major change of your own. Make sure that it really belongs to you. Thanks for bearing with me. Let's go back to our original question. Take a couple of minutes, answer each of the questions, write at least 2 items for each, now that you know more about the different aspects of the objectives, and then I'm going to show you some sample answer. So here's what one student wrote in a test, which I think is fairly good. In terms of the incentives, it's appealing to the middle class, and that can affect the elections. And also it's about avoiding competition. What is being sacrificed? Well, it's liberty, especially if it entails more taxation and government involvement. Otherwise, if the equity is through the people's voluntary participation, then the liberty is preserved. Efficiency could also be sacrificed because the resources are directed into lobbying and rent seeking. Alternatives could be real equity through voluntary participation and respecting the incentives of people to bequeath their wealth. Have a wonderful day. And hereby we reach the end of this series of videos on Introduction to Economics. So congratulations for finishing the course. Being with students in the class is a great pleasure to me. With these videos, I've deprived myself of that. I've been marginalized to a voice on the screen. Oh no, what have I done? I did it because I was convinced that it's more effective for your learning to be engaged with the material actively, with frequent questions and summaries that you have to complete on your own. What I want you to take out of this course is the 3 questions that you got at the beginning and end of each lesson. What are the incentives, sacrifices, and alternatives involved in any decision? Economists are sensitive about these things, and my goal was not to teach you any answers, but to teach you how to ask questions. And this is literally homework for life. And you start with yourself. Every moment of your life is a precious asset. Ask yourself, what are the incentives involved in this decision? What is being sacrificed, and what are the alternatives here? That's what I want you to take. That's the new outlook on life, and it makes you more responsible decision makers. Okay. Thank you for keeping up with all the work in the past 15 weeks, all the effort you put in the course, putting up with my lame jokes. So thanks a lot. I was really impressed. I'm really happy with your performance. I hope you also appreciate the work that was put in making these videos. Each video of about 30 minutes took me more than 10 hours to make. And this is not the first time I'm doing this kind of thing. I've been teaching the course for 10 years. And also the questions on the videos, that was an additional work also. Each concept map took me about 1 hour in average. One of them took me more than 2 hours. And this is just a single slide. So if you found it challenging to do the concept maps, well, you're not alone. Now, basically, I spend my vacation making these videos. I'm telling you this as a way of saying that I care about you. You're not left alone in this jungle. Also, see it as an example of being passionate about one's work. When you start your professional career, try to be passionate about what you do, or do what you're passionate about. It really makes a difference for yourself and for those around you. Anyway, farewell, my dears.